Although one secret that's not much of a secret is her real name was Gertrude, and she hated it. It was her official name. She never used it. When someone called and said, "May I speak to Gertrude?" she knew it was someone she didn't want to talk to. And she always went by Esther, really, except for a brief time during the war. Now, when she was very sick as a baby, her grandfather, who had been at one point a Rosh Yeshiva, sequestered himself. And when he came out, he said that now, after what he had done, her full Hebrew name was Chaya Esther, which was to be used only rarely. But she got better, so whatever he did probably worked. Now, as for names, there'll be some bleed over from both talks, because we are talking about the same person, so let's just accept that. As for names, like I said, she was born August 1st, 1933 in Czechoslovakia. She was the middle daughter again, still, of Eugene and Lily Schoenberger. Her older sister Adriana, who's here with us today, known as Gogi, and her younger sister Judith. Whenever she was asked if she meant that she was from Slovakia, since Czechoslovakia hasn't existed in a while, she would respond, no, she was born in the Czechoslovak Republic. For her, Slovakia meant the fascist state from 1939 to 1945 that sent so many of her relatives and childhood friends to their death. So no, she was born in Michalovce in Czechoslovakia. Her mother's family lived there for generations, and she had many stories about them. Her father had been born nearby in Sobrance, which had been annexed by Hungary in 1939. So even though she was only 5 when that happened, still she had many memories from early childhood with her aunts, uncles, and grandparents. She was always great with languages. She spoke Slovak with her sister and her parents. As a little girl, she had a Fräulein named Hilda, an ethnic German from nearby, and she spoke German with her. As well, one grandmother preferred only to speak German, another one only Hungarian. And as a girl, one of her favorite people, actually until she died, she always spoke very fondly of the woman who ran the kitchen, whom she always referred to by the Hungarian name and nickname Erzsénéni, Aunt Elizabeth. She made sure the girls spoke Hungarian and wouldn't give them anything to eat if they didn't. At least that's what I remember my mom saying. As for Slovak, years later, I went with my parents to a Czech restaurant in New York City, and our waitress was Slovak. When my mom had left the table briefly, the waitress came up and asked me if my mother were an author. I said, no, but why? And the waitress said that my mother spoke such a beautiful and literary Slovak, she was sure she had to be a writer. My mother didn't really dwell on the war years too much, preferring to talk about happier times, although never as though they were some kind of paradise. But her stories about her grandparents, her friends, outnumbered the stories about when they were in hiding, living in the mountains during the war. She also had fun stories about Czechoslovakia after the war, playing and wreaking havoc in a hotel in Karlovy Vary or Carlsbad with one sister. They would go around, they wouldn't tell us, I'll just tell us. There were locks on the doors in these old hotels. You could actually lock from the outside, and people inside could not get out until they called the front desk. So they went on the floor, just locked every door and heard the screaming and went down. She wasn't usually like that, but she was a kid. Or going to the puppet opera in Prague. But there's no denying that she had lived through the Shoah. When Slovakia was formed, Tiso and his government instituted anti-Jewish legislation even more restrictive than the German racial Nuremberg laws. And so, no more regular school for her, only the segregated community Jewish school. In 1942, they escaped the deportation of most of the Jews in Michalovce, as my grandfather has been, what you've been told, an economically necessary Jew. He had owned and managed forests and had a lumber business before. So even though it was Aryanized, they still needed him to manage the business. And even with that, they were in hiding briefly, as even with the pass he had, they could have been taken. 2 years later, when the Germans had occupied Hungary and started deportations across the border, there was another wave of deportations in Slovakia to the death camps. So my mother and her family went up into the Tatra mountains, into villages and towns and open. And they were lucky, as they were only daughters, so there was no telltale Jewish signs if someone wanted to do an inspection. They had false papers, and my mother's name was no longer Esther Schoenberger, but for the duration there, Erzsébet Krasnorska. In Protestant Calvinist villages, the girls and their mother were Calvinist. Their father was Catholic, so he wouldn't have to go to church. In Catholic towns, the reverse. And it was hard for her sometimes to remember the Latin responses in the Mass. And there's one she couldn't remember and said something completely wrong, but it was fine. She was a little girl. Some of this was during the Slovak national uprising against the fascist Slovak regime and the Germans. And it became very violent. And sometimes in towns, sometimes in the wild, in snow and ice. I heard a story about one peasant woman that they rented a room from who slept in a coffin to see how beautiful she would be when she would be dead. And my mother would tell a memory of hiding. She had of hiding and seeing a beautiful wild boar walk by and thinking how it was that here she was like a hunted animal, yet the boar was safe. So she did tell me a story once about when there was a group of Soviet fighters who had been sent to fight with the uprising, many of them freed from prison to take this dangerous job. The commander, Alexei Yegorov, took her without her parents knowing. I don't think my aunt knows this story. Dressed her up in a peasant costume and sent her to town as she spoke fluent German to listen in on what the German soldiers were saying. She went and she even saw one of the Russian soldiers who had snuck away to town speaking with the SS. And she came back and reported. No, I don't think my aunt knows that story. Anyway, I don't think it ended well for the Russian. So once they were liberated, they went back home. My mom would say that she didn't really have any relief or joy coming back because she saw her grandparents' house and houses of friends and relatives she knew, and saw that there was no one from the family to greet them. It was already full of ghosts. And she swore she would never speak German again, and she only did so twice that I know of. And even so, they were still quite lucky. Another family returning from the mountains, the Deutsches, whose daughter Dora was maybe my mother's best friend, met with anti-Semitic partisans on the way back, and Dora was killed. My mother named my sister Dorit after her, and Dora's brother, born after the war, Paul, said he'd be here today. I imagine he's here. He's here. Hi, Paul. Anyway, in 1948, the country became communist. Now, my grandfather had been active in the Palästina Amt, a Zionist group, and they prepared to go to Israel. She said that the same confiscating bureaucrats who had come to Aryanize the property under the fascists came again to nationalize the property under the communists. Same people. So they left, and, well, I'll tell stories later. She remembered the trip from there to Italy to Bari to take the boat to Israel vividly, and we used to hear about that. Arriving in Israel, she now had to quickly master a new language, Hebrew, completely unrelated to anything she knew, and she did it, and finished high school. She had to study English as a foreign language, as they didn't accept any of her languages on the curriculum. Her uncle Akiva, who had lived in Mandate Palestine since the late 30s, tutored her in grammar, which is very complicated in Hebrew, and instilled a respect in her for Arabic. As he said, it was the model for the development of Hebrew grammar systems. He had studied Arabic and Hebrew at Charles University in Prague before immigrating. She always loved art and design, and she attempted to get into the Bezalel School for Art. An instructor there, a woman originally from Czechoslovakia, gave her the practicum of an exam to see if she could be admitted, which was partly to place just items in a room space. Like, where would you put these? There was a diagram. She told her after that she passed and she could be admitted, and there could even be scholarship, but complications at home precluded her from going. So she set her sights on teaching. She was in a program for teaching certification, and there was basically an emergency given the huge immigration influx and the need for teachers. So she started. Living in Netanya in Israel, she was given incredibly challenging assignments. She taught a class with many children with Down syndrome. She taught another class with recent poor immigrants from Libya, from Tripoli, some of whom were illiterate even in their own language, most knew no Hebrew at all, and some were in very violent circumstances. She came up with methods of teaching language using pictures, and would use some of her meager salary for supplies, especially colored paper and pens. She received a commendation, and the schools, I was told, were using her methods, for which she received no credit, as the school took all the credit. I believe it had something to do with the Elef Milim method, for those who are acquainted with it. She met my father when on a date with a friend of his in a hotel bar in Netanya. He liked her a lot. She liked him more than she liked his friend. And one thing led to another, and they got married. While my dad was working for the Israel Water Project, Tahal, he came on a trip through these United States. And on the positive side, it convinced him more than ever that they could immigrate and have a much better life here. On the negative side, the trip was in 1956, and the Sinai War broke out. Israel was on a war footing, and my mother found herself in a nation at war. My impression from her was that there were still shortages, and she felt very scared with her husband out of the country and trying to make ends meet. And she had lived through enough wars. So after that, she was really ready to think about moving. The move was delayed by her becoming pregnant and by being prescribed serious bed rest so as to keep the pregnancy, which ended up with me. So that was a good thing from my perspective. They came to the US in 1959, settling in the Los Angeles area, trying to get established in a new country again, although with relatives here, but most of them had arrived only a few years before. This was a challenge. We lived in 4 different rentals for the first 6 years. And as befits a growing family, a good idea, my sister Dorit came along a few years later. And so my mother now had a new project, to use her phrase, the role of parenting, the career of parenting, which was to civilize and introduce children to the world around them. She said she couldn't ensure mastery or enthusiasm, but her task was to introduce her children, and then if they took to it, they could fly. She never loved driving freeways, for example, but would drive them to take us to music lessons completely across the valley. Now, being Jewish was very much a part of who she was, and she saw no conflict with that and an interest in modern music, art, design, architecture. When we could travel, once my father's business started doing well and we were a bit older, there was a stretch with some great trips to the eastern US, to Mexico City, to Europe, to Israel. And the point was to introduce us to the world around us. But holidays certainly were also observed. When I was small, we would have Kiddush at home, we had a sukkah, and in later years we would have one every year. And I think many of you have been to the sukkah they had at their house. Every Passover and Purim and Hanukkah and Shavuot, we'd be at her parents', who'd come to Los Angeles some years after she had, as well as both her sisters eventually immigrating here. My mom was so good at teaching and at cultivating both others and herself. I remember talking with her when I was in college about the educational theories of Pestalozzi. There were books of educational theory around the house, as well as works on psychology, which interested her deeply. Although she herself never played an instrument, always loving the harp and hoping someday to learn, she loved orchestral and vocal music. She told us that she grew up hearing songs and arias, that the local tailor or shoemaker would sing arias while they worked. When we were small, there were always summer trips to the Hollywood Bowl, and eventually she would have season subscriptions to the Philharmonic and later to the opera. I can still remember her making sure we'd see performances while traveling. Ballet and theater in New York, the San Francisco Opera, doing La Boheme when we were still quite small, Aida, the Caracalla Baths in Rome, Madame Butterfly in the Arena at Verona, Ariadne and Bluebeard at the Paris Opera. There were not a lot of trips, it sounds like it, but they really weren't. They were quite full though, and each one was deeply memorable. And again, the point was to be introduced. And with Jewish culture, she remembered fondly her poetry classes and the poetry of the Golden Age of Spain, a beautiful synagogue in Venice or in Carpentras in France or in Amsterdam would impress her more than another Gothic cathedral. She had her books of Tchaikovsky's Hebrew poems, which was interesting as the books about Kabbalah that she would devour, and even Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. I remember her talking about Frankl's logotherapy even when I was a small kid. And the extended family would take trips to Lake Tahoe. And this might surprise people who knew her later in life. She would go skiing with my father. And often she would hire a ski instructor, which would help her cut the line, and she'd ski at her pace while my father sped down the hills. And Tahoe was great because it had slopes in the winter, the lake in summer, and casinos and shows at night. While my father would gamble passionately and loved the risk, he would amass many markers on some visits. And in the last 24, even 36 hours sometimes, my mother would sit patiently at the blackjack table and play and win back all of his markers, and we would leave often a little bit ahead. She was actually very practical, making decisions on investments even into her 80s. She would research, and she loved her iPad. She learned how to do stock research on it and would read story after story, and would play bridge on the computer. She was a little afraid of it, I think. The whole Chapek RUR, play with the robots, would come up whenever she was learning. But once she had the skill, she would run with it. She was very giving and exceptionally loving. Over the years, she would help, I think so. Over the years, she would help women who had worked for her to learn enough American history to pass the citizenship examination. I would say that one of her best and closest friends, who's sitting back here with us, began as her hairdresser's assistant when they were both quite young. Amelia is back here. They would have lunch together. My mom would go to Lake Tahoe with her sometimes. When she was in Cal Rehab last winter, and also after her stroke, Amelia would come to the rehab and to the house and do my mother's hair there to brighten her spirits. And she was doing a good job. I had to drive her sometimes. She didn't like the mountain roads, but we all do our part. My mother had a serious stroke 3 days after the inauguration of the man currently in the White House. She had become quite nervous with the inauguration speech, I recall, it bringing back very, very difficult memories of a much scarier time in her life. In the last 2 years, she had at times regained much of her strength. She had walked up the stairs and could get around a bit with a heavy walker. My father's health was already quite compromised at that point, but they were together much of the time, and that bond was there and deeply so. They were in their 65th year of marriage when he passed away last October. But when he would go play backgammon out in the club, and they'd be out there till 2 or 3 in the morning. This went on into their 70s, and actually well into my dad's 80s. And my mother would be there, not always till the end of the night, but often. And it would be great if she could get her own card game going there, but often she was just sitting there. And the rabbi's speech made me remember something. When I was in junior high, I was taken into a group. They were just doing like a focus group of the students, asking about the grape boycott and the lettuce boycott and what we were doing. And I remember one friend was very active about it, and her mother had been very active about it, and everyone knew her mother had been very active about it. And we really never talked about it, so I didn't know if we were doing it or not. I just didn't know. I assumed we hadn't talked about it. And I came home and I said, Esther, were you ever involved in this book? I said, oh, I haven't bought grapes in years, or lettuce. But she didn't talk about it. It's like they made the decision of what to buy, and she decided that she wasn't going to support while those people were living in such horrible conditions. So she made a profession out of her children, out of her relationships. When my father became ill with complications of sarcoidosis, my mom arranged for caregiving, for the equipment, for the cycles of medication to be monitored properly. When I had a surgery years ago, around the age of 40, too many years ago, I moved back in for convalescence. When my sister broke her leg a few years ago, my mom arranged for her to have assistance for her own caregiving, from her own caregivers. Some of the people who helped care for my mother and father in the last 2.5 years are here today. I'd like to mention them. Among the caregivers, Mauro, Ramon, Gladys, Angela, and Dion. Her physical therapist who worked tirelessly with her, Yusao Chuen, and her very good friends and housekeepers on whom she relied and whom she loved dearly, Berta and Damari Portillo. In the last 48 hours or so, I've received so many lovely messages and texts from people responding to the news that to many people, even those who loved her and whom she loved but called her Mrs. Vered, that Mrs. Vered had passed away. Esther, my sister's mother. For me, she was the base reference, so I think I'll just read a few of the excerpts from those that saw her in ways that I couldn't. So here was one that just came today with some flowers that I really liked. I have to find it. Sorry, here we go. Jerome Vered, so sorry for the loss of the beautiful Esther. I always considered her the pinnacle of graciousness, humor, and sophistication, a model for us all. Another quote, as I told your sister, I loved your mom, but what I loved most about her was her voice. The way she spoke, the elegance of the voice along with the accent and how well she spoke. It really stands out in my memory of her. I'm going to add here that her laugh was wonderful, distinctive, original. It really did have a bell-like quality, at least to me. And the quotes brought back comments I remember from friends about how wise my mother was, what good advice she could mete out. Maybe more of these at the Shiva if you come over. In so many messages, the terms kind, very generous, welcoming stand out as well as wise and elegant. Here's another brief excerpt I wanted to share. Jerome, I am so saddened to learn of Esther's passing. Certainly she was one of a kind. Intelligence, generosity, humor, combined with an understanding of the human condition, made her one of the most interesting and treasured women, and has been my pleasure to know. She was a real darling, and I had hoped someday that she and I could have another nice walk together, even if it was to be with a walker in a wheelchair. The month I spent with your mother in Tahoe in early 1986 was the best month ever. I think in many ways my mother and her sisters, and in his way my father, were and are very much part of our time in this world. And also, though, having grown up in Central Europe a bit between the wars, carried vestiges of those cultures destroyed by the Shoah and by the war, both Jewish and non-Jewish. They had memories and experiences of the first decade of life in the now newly restored state of Israel. And still, she spent 60 years of her life using English and some Spanish in the United States. And for me, I assume my sister, most important, she was a source of strong, unconditional love and support, thrilled with our accomplishments, sympathetic to our struggles, very concerned, a role model for how to engage with so many facets of the world, nature, culture, and to carry on positively after setbacks and tragedy. And her loss is personally a near unspeakable tragedy, although I've been speaking for quite a while now. And if you want to hear stories of the 2 times she spoke German after her vow of never speaking it again, or her reaction when I told her that I was studying German at the LA Goethe Institute, please come to the Shiva, get-togethers and services in our home, and I'll tell you there. Jews are welcome, we need you to count, and everyone else is welcome, so we want you to be there. So, please come.